board just to click on that.
So it's going, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is. So thank you very much, Bishop John, for taking time out of your schedule to join us and to guide us. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Canon Michael, and welcome everyone to this talk on the teachings of St. John Paul. Now, it's a mammoth task, as you can imagine. The way that I have chosen to do is not to cover absolutely everything, but selected points, and to do it in this particular way. I'm going to take you through his life, and at each stage of his life I'll try to show how a teaching relates to his life. His biographer George Weigel spoke of John Paul as a witness to hope, and really his teaching was tied up in the way that he lived his life. So the first part, obviously, let's begin at the beginning. St. John Paul was born in 1920 in the town of Wadowice, which was 50 kilometers from Krakow in Poland. So the first thing that to say about John Paul is that he was Polish, and we can say much more than that. He was a Polish patriot, and so in John Paul, we can learn the important lessons of patriotism, and how to be genuinely patriotic without being narrowly nationalistic. Well, John Paul had a profound sense of being Polish that he got from the Romantic Polish writers of the 19th century, and they had seen through the great suffering of Poland through the generations and centuries, where so often it was invaded by north, south, east and west. So often it was never left in peace to be its own state, and yet it remained a country and a nation. That he had this sense picked up from the 19th century Polish writers that Poland had a mission among the nations, just like the people of God in Israel in the Old Testament, that they had a mission among the nations round about to be a light to them. They carried a special vocation that he saw there for his patriotism, not in terms of politics, but or not in a political sense, but he saw it in a theological sense. To be patriotic for John Paul was to be Christian. To be Christian was to be patriotic in the best sense of the word, just like the people of God in the Old Testament, a people of faith, and also a people who loved with an authentic love their own nation. And John Paul had an idea of what makes a nation, and what's called a personalistic sense of this, that a nation is like a big family, and just like families have their own particular traits, qualities, characteristics, so do nations have their own qualities and characteristics. Where do these come from? Often enough, it's from their heroes, from their significant figures in their history that very much determine the characteristics of the nation. And that's why he thought it was so important that Christians love their countries, and that Christians rise up to be heroes and significant figures in their nations, so that their nations can have those characteristics that are Christian, learned from the great heroes. Well, obviously Poland, they saw way back in the first millennium, was so much of its characteristics and its personality was founded on St. Stanislaw, the Bishop of Krakow, who stood up to the King Boleslaw, who stood up to him for his cruelties and injustices, and excommunicated him. And any time Boleslaw came into the cathedral, he'd stop the celebration of Mass, and annoyed Boleslaw so much that he put Stanislav to death. But thereafter, the Polish people following Stanislaw realised that there are there are values that are more fundamental than the laws of the state, and the laws of the state have to respect, and the values of God and the values written into human dignity. So John Paul wrote a lot about patriotism in a book called Memory and Identity. Maybe important for us, just one thing we can think of, that there is so much talk about patriotism these days. What does it mean to love your country? And that we can't see that from a theological sense. God wants us to love our countries, but the way that we love our countries is by bringing them to God, and by bringing God to them. And then finally, this point that we said that Poland was often enough invaded by this state and that other state, and yet it still remained a country. And so John Paul's idea of patriotism is yes, it's about land, of course, it's about the spiritual values of a people, and making sure that those spiritual values are the ones that thrive. So maybe in our own time, we can think of Scotland. What makes Scotland a nation? What are the Christian values that are part and parcel of who we are? How can we really love our country? But how can we love our country by exalting those Christian values? So that's the first point. Well, next point is his family. He was born into a family that was a mother, Carol Joseph, and a father, Carol Joseph, and a mother, Emilia. And in that family, there was Olga, sister, and his brother Edmund, and himself. That's what made up the Wojtyła family, except to say that when, before Carol, before Pope John Paul was born, his elder sister had already died. When he was 9 years old, his mother died, leaving just himself, his father, and his elder brother Edmund, who was a doctor to whom John Paul looked up to very much. And then when John Paul was 12, his brother died as a doctor and helping out in the outbreak of scarlet fever. So he's left only with himself and his dad, whom he loved very much. And they had a great intimacy, and his father died when he was 21. So by the time John Paul was 21, his closest relative was a second cousin. His life, therefore, from 21 was a life of solitude. It caused him to develop a contemplative soul, but he thought a lot about solitude and began to realize that it was important in our lives. It wasn't a curse, but certainly the circumstance that came about in him were tragic, but it's a blessing to have time of solitude. And this experience of solitude he wrote into his theology of the body, where we hear that in the scriptures it's not good that man should be alone, which he interpreted as no longer good that man should be alone, because until that point it was good that Adam and every human person has solitude. It was the solitude where he walked alone with God and got to know God. It was a solitude where God put him to work, and he learned the meaning of having to work in the world. It was a solitude where God asked him to name all of the animals, and we began to realize, well, what's my name? What's my identity? What's my meaning? It was a solitude where he learned the drama of choice, of the which fruit to eat, which fruit not to eat. It was a solitude where he was confronted with the possibility of death. If you eat this, you shall die. And so in solitude, we learn very many things. And put all together, he thought that in solitude, we learn self-possession. And we can't give ourselves unless we possess ourselves. And it's only the point where he possessed himself that he was ready to give himself to Eve, and then it was no longer good that he be alone. But flipping that round, John Paul believed that for all of us, we need to find space for solitude, for the battle with ourselves, getting to know God and the important things about life, so that our lives then continue to be lives of giving. And solitude isn't something that we learn just at the beginning of our lives and then the rest of our lives are communion. You know, all the time, at every stage, we have to go into solitude of self-possession to come out of the solitude of self-giving. Well, as I said, that his solitude came about from tragedy, and therefore his contemplative soul became the contemplative soul of the Carmelite. He was going to join the Carmelites, but just stopped pretty much at the last minute. It's going to be a Carmelite because its spirituality is a spirituality of the cross. It was a spirituality of suffering and finding meaning in suffering. He thought that suffering is something which is an inevitability in our lives. No one escapes suffering. The world can't ever eradicate suffering, but it presents us with a question. And some people answer by saying, well, because there is suffering, there can't be a God. And that doesn't take the suffering away. The suffering remains, even if we get rid of God. It just means the suffering has no meaning. Suffering is absurd and it can become destructive. Or we can take suffering to the cross, unite it with Christ. Suffering, we see it as a meaning and it opens up to us. Our own sufferings open up to us secrets and mysteries of life, and our life is more meaningful because of suffering accepted and offered up. Well, then he, after high school, he took up his studies in Krakow's Jagiellonian University in the School of Drama, and he was studying at this point literature and philology. You know, what is language? The mystery of language. How did human beings create language? What are words? And he knew that as human beings, we express ourselves in writing, in words, and he was fascinated by human identity, human meaning, human dignity. Those are all things that really fascinated him, and he knew that we express those in words. He was interested in how we express, how words show our identity, our meaning, our dignity, and that's what he wanted to study at university. But very quickly saw that human beings aren't just facts; they're full of meaning and significance, and therefore you can't simply get to the human person by prose, and poetic tells a little bit more about who we are. And then finally he came to the conclusion, actually, we don't know who we are and to see how we live in life and confront the drama of life. It's in confronting the drama of life that each human person discovers who he or she is, not just thinking about things, but by engaging in life. He wrote the book The Acting Person, and he wrote plays himself. And he thought it was only through drama that we really understood fully, or more fully, what it means to be human. And he saw that in theology as well. At the Old Testament, there was the Word that revealed itself to us in various ways and various different times through the prophets. But ultimately, if God is going to reveal himself fully to us, he's got to reveal himself in the person of his Son. And seeing how his Son lives and breathes and lives among us, we discover what it is to be human. And that would be written up later in the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes. It's only in the mystery of Jesus Christ and his gospel in his life that we discover what it really means to be human. Well, his studies began in studies began, but were interrupted after his first year abruptly by the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939, and you know, notoriously that they rounded up the professors of the Jagiellonian University and put them to death, and the university was closed, and students had to go to work or they would be deported if they weren't useful. So John Paul Carroll went off to work in the quarries in the bitter cold of winter, where all they had were fairly flimsy denim outfits and clogs on their shoes where they'd walk through the snow, and the job was to cut open huge stones and carry them from here to there. But He was very popular and he got on well with his fellow workers who saw him as the bookish student, but it gave him an experience of being a worker. Latterly, he went to the Solway chemical plant and he thought a lot about work. And again, this will be written into Theology of the Body. Is work just a punishment for sin? And had Adam and Eve not sinned, would there be no work? Would we just be still loitering about and lazing about in the garden? And that was the view of some theologians. I think that would be principally the view of St. Augustine, that work is a punishment. But there are other theologians like Albert who say, no, it's not just a punishment, it's a blessing. John Paul very much took that view. And part of it is the punishment of sin, all the difficulties and the strife and the fatigue, but it's a participation in creation. God gives us the garden and then invites us to cultivate it. We become participants, partners in a covenant of creation with him. And again, he'll write that into Theology of the Body when he talks about responsible parenthood, that we're partners in a covenant of life with God. And so it's good for us to think about these things, because most of us are workers. When we go out of our bed in the morning, we just see work as a necessary evil. Well, John Paul, through the quarries and through the chemical plant, thought a lot about the meaning of work. The work gives us dignity, and we give work dignity. Through work, we grow as human beings, and through work, we are able to build up God's creation. It doesn't need to be the work of the sacristy. Any good work in the world builds up creation, but also caused them to think about the dignity of workers, the rights of workers, and the relationship of workers to employees, to labour, to capital. He thought a lot about that in his encyclicals, and he thought work doesn't need to be a binary, polarised reality between employers and employees, between capital and work. There's got to be a way where they're harmonised in the one project, which is the dignity of man, of humanity. Well, after a couple of years working in the quarry, in the chemical factory, his vocation began to develop. In 1942, he was aware of his call of the priesthood, and he began to take courses in the underground seminary in Krakow that had been set up by Cardinal Sapia. So his introduction into seminary was underground. It was clandestine, because the Nazis at the time had suppressed religion, and this gave him, and controlled it. This gave him this, these ideas, these thoughts, these reflections on freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and the power of religion, the strength of religion, the vitality of religion over the state. This is important in our times, isn't it? Where there's this exquisite balance in this pandemic, where we're trying to work out with the government in extreme measures. Yes, the government has to have these powers, but how do we respect also freedom of religion and conscience? John Paul knew that worship of God was a duty, and it was a duty that can't be taken away by the authorities. I think our authorities realise that, and certainly from what they're saying to us. But after the war, it was out of the frying pan into the fire, because at the Yalta Treaty, the Nazis left and the Soviets came in, and it really, John Paul's experience therefore of seminary and of his early time in the church was of aggressive secular regimes that wanted to do away with God. They thought only once we do away with God can humanity really be free. Only with God out of the way can we really reach our full potential as human beings, because otherwise God is holding us back. This is the time of Nietzsche, who says well, the times after Nietzsche, says God is dead because we have killed him, because we had to, in order to really thrive as human beings. Or Voltaire, who says that there isn't any God and there's no Garden of Eden. We've got to cultivate our own gardens. There's no religions to hold, authentic religions to hold us back. We've got to look after ourselves. John Paul could see in himself and his people that any attempts to do away with God were futile, because God was real. He was our creator. Our relationship with him was real, and it was in with our DNA. It was in our fingertips. And take away God, and you can't take away God without taking away humanity. And this idea that John Paul had would be written up again in Gaudium et Spes in the Second Vatican Council, where the insight was that without the creator, the creature disappears. When God is forgotten, humanity becomes unintelligible to ourselves. We can't make sense of ourselves. The state can't make sense of us. Only God makes sense of who I am. Only when I have God can I have myself. And John Paul, throughout his time as a pastor, as a priest in Soviet communism, saw this fact, this reality growing and growing and growing. And when he became Pope, very quickly he asked to come back to Poland, and he was eventually granted permission to come back and celebrated Mass famously in Warsaw Square, where 1 million Poles had gathered. And he knew all he had to do was to give the Polish people confidence again in their belief in God. That's all that had to be done. And he would set in train a spiritual revolution without firing a gun that no state would ever be able to gainsay. And in that wonderful homily at the Mass in Warsaw, he ended by saying, I cry, I am a son of the land of Poland. I, who am also Pope John Paul II, I cry from the depths of this millennium. I cry in the vigil of Pentecost. Let your spirit descend. Let your spirit descend and renew the face of the earth, the face of this land. And as soon as he finished, the 1 million Poles started shouting, we want God, we want God. Those who were there say that they looked into the eyes of the Soviet regime and they knew it was finished. They knew the game was up. The game was a bogey, as it were, and that set in train. Our need for God just overran the false power of the totalitarian state. Mikhail Gorbachev later said that the collapse of Soviet communism would not have been thinkable without Pope John Paul. And Henry Kissinger, the great diplomat, said, it's difficult to imagine a figure more influential on the 20th century than John Paul. Well, after the Second World War, he was ordained as a priest. He continued his studies in the seminary in Krakow and the faculty of the Jagiellonian University. He was ordained a priest in 1946, and he also lived his priesthood reflectively, thought a lot about what the priesthood was. And he wrote this up 50 years later in his book, in the 50th anniversary of his priesthood, Gift and Mystery. He wrote up that the priesthood is this wonderful exchange. When he, as a young man, gave his life into the priesthood, it wasn't so much that he was losing himself, but he was, in giving up himself, he was making space for Christ to come into him, and Christ lived in him. So he spoke of this wonderful exchange. My life now is Christ living in me, as St. Paul said. And he went on to say in that book that our priesthood, our authentic priesthood, is profoundly Eucharistic. He said we as priests act in the person of Christ. The person of Christ acts in us when we celebrate Mass. And then He said, so we should never lose, a lovely phrase, we should never lose our Eucharistic amazement or astonishment. We should be astonished if we can. Ask for the grace to be astonished at the Mass. I remember an old priest once saying that to me, and it never left me as I was just being ordained. And he said to me, he was about 40, 50 years ordained, a holy priest. He said, John, I've never lost the awe. He said, thank God for it. He never lost the awe of celebrating Mass every day. It's a gift not all of us have, but it's one that we asked for. And then he also reflected on how the word host, ostium, means victim, that Christ to be present in the Eucharist comes to us as a victim, and that the priest who shouldn't be afraid of the sacrifice that comes with our lives. He said that people have profound expectations of our priests today, but in the end, what they're asking for of us is simply to be ministers of God's mercy. To be merciful is what they're looking for. They want to see in us a man who is in contact with God. To come to the priest is to come close to someone who is in contact with God. Our holiness, we're called to be holy, but not just on our knees. He said our holiness, priestly holiness, and every holiness is distinct. Priestly holiness is in the care of souls. As we care for souls, we become holy. And to be men of our words. People want that from us. He said the world looks for priests. The world looks for priests engaged with the world. And therefore we need to be men of study who know how to engage with the times, the signs of the times, not confrontationally, but in partnership with all those searching for the truth. And shortly afterwards, he was sent back to Rome to take his doctorate in faith according to John of the Cross. And while he was in summer holidays, he would go to Belgium, France, and Holland and minister to the Polish immigrants there. And that kind of balance between study and ministry he found very fruitful. And those were insights he later brought into his synodal exhortation, Pastoris Dabo Vobis, that the priestly formation can't just be academic. It's got to be spiritual, it's got to be human, it's got to be academic, it's got to be pastoral as well. That if we're going to be formed, we're going to be formed in pastoral life as well as academic study, in personal growth, and in spiritual closeness to God. And all of that was brought together in that lovely golden thread that ran through Pastoris Dabo Vobis. What brings everything together? The spiritual, the human, the academic, the pastoral. Pastoral charity. And everything we do as priests, we have the love of a shepherd. Well, then after that, he returned to Poland, became an assistant priest, and was eventually sent to the university chaplaincy in Krakow, where he also became part of the faculty teaching in moral theology and social ethics, and also in the seminary. And took his next doctorate, two doctorates. Next one was on Max Scheler and the possibility of the foundation of a Catholic ethic from Max Scheler. Well, what's probably worthwhile saying there is Max Scheler wasn't a theologian in the church. He was a secular philosopher of ethics, and he had a real love-hate relationship with the church as well. But John Paul thought he had something worthwhile, even though he was a secular philosopher. He thought he had something useful to say about what it means to be a person and about ethics. And so he studied him, and that tells us something about John Paul and the church of our times. That is that in the search for the truth, it's not a competition between the church and the world. It's not a competition in which the church is the goodies and the world's the baddies. No, John Paul in studying Max Scheler was saying, well, God can enlighten natural human intelligence to find truth about what it means to be human, as well as enlightening the church. And therefore, but in collaboration, we try to be in collaboration with all those in search of truth in the world, and some of their insights can enrich the church just like the church can. So we don't have a hostile view to the church. We don't think that the world is bad. We presume the world is good with good insights, but have to be redeemed. It was from Shaler that he took the methodology of phenomenology, big word, but it's really important because it really was what made theology of the body the huge step forward in Catholic anthropology, understanding of the person, and ethics and sexuality. Shaler was a phenomenologist. That was a 20th century school that said, try not to come to things with preconceptions. Don't come to realities. For a while, don't come to realities with your own teachings and dogmas and ideas of how things should be or how you'd expect them to be. So that's important, but we also have to come to things without any presuppositions. Just take a long, hard look at the thing in itself. What does the thing look like in itself? Just describe, observe, describe, look long and hard. John Paul was really fascinated by that, and he took it into the story of Genesis. He said, well, let's just look at the experience of Adam and Eve, because the scriptures offer that up as well. What did it feel like for Adam to be in innocent love with Eve? What did it feel like for Eve to be in innocent love with Adam? Just look at them. Look at them without any preconception. What was the experience of their original communion? What did it feel like for them? What was their experience of nakedness without shame before each other? What did that feel like? Never to want to use the other, but always to want to give to the other. What did it feel like? What was that original joy as a feeling? And then, as we get to Genesis 3, what did it feel like when Adam began to betray Eve? What did he feel like when he was using her as an object? What did it feel like when Eve was ashamed before Adam, because the one that was supposed to love and protect her was now threatening her? What did it feel like to have their relationship broken, their not being able to trust? What did it feel like to feel God at a distance, no longer a father, but now someone who was their opponent? What did it feel like when the work just gave them brambles? And he describes these very well in those original experience, original communion, original nakedness, or innocence, nakedness without shame, and then those negative experiences after sin, shame, male shame, female shame. And then what does it feel like when someone comes along and offers you redemption? So he just described the feeling. At the end of Theology of the Body, he said, I'm not asking you to judge this on church teaching. I've opened up for you what it feels like to follow God, what it feels like to follow your own way. And I ask you, am I right? Does it feel like this? And what do you really want to feel like? And that was such a huge step forward in Catholic anthropology, social ethics, and sexuality. But as I say, he got it from a secular philosopher, although he developed it in a way which was genius. Well, in 1958, he was appointed Auxiliary Bishop of Krakow, 1964, Archbishop of Krakow, 1967, Cardinal. All of this was happening during or just in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council. And one of the things to know about St. John Paul, no one was a greater evangelist of the Second Vatican Council or disciple of it than St. John Paul. Many people in this day and age think, was the council a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Or this, that? Was it? John Paul was absolutely sure that the council was the breathing of the Holy Spirit upon the world, and he was the last bishop in. He was when he was ordained just as the council was starting. He was literally the last bishop in the door, and by the time it was finished, he'd made huge contributions to Gaudium et Spes. And then after he went to every synod of bishops as well. What did it teach him? So many things you couldn't say. But what it taught him is that the Lord reveals himself to us not just through the Pope, but through the Pope with the bishops, not just through the bishops, but the bishops with their people. And this whole thing about synodality. John Paul was a great believer in synodality. The Holy Spirit speaks through all of us, and when we all come together, then everyone contributing what the Spirit said to them, then we're fuller for it. He became Pope in 1978, and we know that as he became Pope, his motto was from Louis Marie de Montfort, Totus Tuus, not from the scriptures, but from Louis Marie de Montfort with the big M on his emblem. John Paul was a great lover of Our Lady. At one point, he said, he initially, before he read St. Louis Marie de Montfort's True Devotion, he said, I couldn't understand Our Lady. Why not go straight to Jesus? Why not go straight to Jesus? It is only through reading and rereading and rereading a true devotion to Mary that he understood, as he put it. I realized, he said, that I couldn't exclude God's mother from my life without rejecting the will of the Trinity. So he consecrated himself, and he was a great advocate of that, saying to Jesus through Mary that Our Lady was at the very heart and centre of God's plan and its fulfilment, and therefore we have to put her at the very heart and centre of our Christian discipleship. Well, then, no sooner had his feet touched the ground than he began his pastoral visits. Some of you might remember those very well. Visited went on over 100 pastoral visits outside Italy, visiting virtually every country in the world. 150 pastoral visits in Italy, visited 300, and saw virtually all of the parishes of Rome. He believed that God had called him to be a missionary, to be an evangelist, to take God's message to the ends of the earth. And it was only 2 years into his papacy that he coined the phrase new evangelization. He said, we sense the Holy Spirit asking us to put the whole of the resources of the church to a new evangelization, new in ardor, in methods and expressions. Well, here's new evangelization here, because it's new in methods. We're using the internet and online. Also new in expression. He said the perennial teaching of the church has to make sense to men and women of the 20th century of the new millennium. We can't just give those truths of the faith in 19th century language or in 12th century language. We've got to find 21st century language for the same faith. So new in expressions and methods, but new in ardor. Some people forget that. He said we need new zeal. And we really get zeal. God blesses the church when we go out. He doesn't bless us so much when we stay in and maintain. It's important. If we want to see real renewal of the church, it happens when we go out. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to say about young people. No pope made more of an electrifying connection with young people than John Paul in his establishment of World Youth Days, 19 of which were held under him. But why did young people love him? Because they saw not only did he give everything of himself, but he asked everything of them. He spoke to them and he said, you're living in really challenging times. But you get two choices. One choice, you can either just become cynical and say the world is cynical, I'm going to be cynical, I'm going to live for myself. Or you can do what my generation tried to do. You can be idealistic. You can rise above the cynicism and you can make something new. And then he also kind of famously said that that the best pastoral approach to young people is not to make them objects of your pastoral concern, not to do things for them, but to evangelize them, to get them to be evangelizers for the church, subjects who will evangelize with you. He expressed that so well when he came to Scotland and to Murrayfield and spoke to many of us, and I was there at the time, and I can find what he said. I'll read it out to you. This is what he said to the young people at Murrayfield, and one of the best addresses I think he ever great. And he told the story of the little boy bringing the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes to Jesus that Andrew presented. He said, the point I wish to make is this: St. Andrew gave Jesus all there was available. Jesus miraculously fed those 5,000 people and still had something left over. And he said, it's exactly the same with your lives. Left alone to face the difficult challenges of life today, you feel conscious of your inadequacy and afraid of what the future may hold for you. But I say this to you: place your lives in the hands of Jesus. He'll accept you and bless you, and he'll make such use of your lives as is beyond your greatest expectations. You can see how he was such a galvanizing effect in young people. Also families. He established the World Meeting of Families and the post-synodal exhortation Familiaris Consortio. He famously said, as the family goes, so goes the world. The well-being of the family determines the well-being of the world. If the family is weak, the world is weak. If the family collapses, the world collapses. And therefore, his message is always strengthen the family. Strengthen the family. It's the first school of love. It's the first school of the person. It's there that we learn the giving and taking that makes us good citizens and good national leaders and good world leaders. World leaders that come from families of love will lead the world well. World leaders that don't come from families of love and that formation will not lead families well. There's more I could say, but I think I'm going to skip a whole lot and just he led the church into the millennium. He canonized 500 saints of all walks of life, saints who drove cars to show that we in every walk of life in this day are called to be holy. He oversaw the catechism of the Catholic Church and the renewal of the Code of Canon Law. His death. He died, as we know, on the Saturday after Easter Sunday, which is the vigil of Divine Mercy Sunday, a Sunday that he established as a universal feast to be celebrated throughout the world. Some people say, if you want to understand John Paul's papacy, it was to reveal to the world and to the church God's mercy. The revelations of divine mercy came during the 2 world wars, where the aggressive secularism and the power of science and technology was putting into the hands of humanity enormous power, really to do the most inhumane things. When we think of the terrible world wars and the great inhumanity of man to man, when it forgot about God and when it unbridled all this power. But he says, these things, the 20th century is not crying out to God for vengeance, is crying out to heaven for mercy. And the further away we get from God and the more powerful we seem, the more God responds with mercy, not with condemnation. Well, he died in the vigil of divine mercy, having preached mercy. His last words when he was dying, and when he died, 3 million people came from all over the world to pass by his remains, some standing 24 hours to wait to do so. As he was dying, his penultimate words were, when he saw the crowds of young people flocking into St. Peter's Square, he sent a message out saying, I went looking for you, and now you've come to find me, and I thank you for this. And in that way, he expressed his life and as a sacrament of God's love in Christ, that we are called, like Jesus Christ, to go out with God's love for the world in the highways and the byways, to go out and out and out and find the lost and the broken and the wandering and the worried and the wondering, to go out and out and out. And then eventually they come to us. St. John said, this is the love I mean, not our love for God, but God's love for us. And he sent his son to be the sacrifice that takes our sins away. In his final words, paraphrasing or slightly changing Psalm 121, I rejoiced when they said, I heard them say, let us go to God's house. His last words were, let me go to my Father's house. Changed the word God to Father, because if he was the Pope whose mission was to show the mercy of God to the world, his mission also was to reveal that above all, God is our Father.
Thank you very much, Bishop John. That was great. I don't know whether you can start the recording now, and it gives people a wee bit more freedom for questions. I'm sure the 30 of us who are here found that